Back with you for hour number 3 of the Green Mountain Mornings program on WKVT 100.3 FM and AM 1490. And it is the Tuesday in which we get together with Mike Faher, who writes for VTDigger as well as the Brattleboro Reformer and the Commons. You can find his byline on a number of stories in all those publications. You can also follow him on Twitter at Mike Faher. Happy Valentine's Day to you, Mike.
Yeah, happy Valentine's Day.
Indeed. Good to have you in here on a Tuesday, and a lot of things going on. Well, we've been talking about a lot of things going on in the world, but certainly plenty of things going on here in the state of Vermont, right here in our local community. Vermont Yankee continues to be a big story in our community. You reported yesterday that the Vermont Public Service Board has announced after a February 1st meeting that they're going to hold 2 public hearings down in Vernon. This is good news.
Yeah, so several of the local folks who are trying to participate in the review of the sale of Vermont Yankee, including the Windham Regional Commission, really felt there was a need for at least 1, maybe 2 public meetings in this area so that the Public Service Board, which is going to theoretically issue a approval for this sale, could hear directly from concerned residents.
Now, Entergy, which owns the plant now and is selling it to North Star Group, have both expressed a desire to move this process along.
Right.
And it seems like this is actually a nice compromise when I read the timeline of how it's laid out. It seems like it's a nice compromise of giving the local community due deference as far as giving input on different things, but also adhering to the timeline. If they do approve the sale, they're doing it within the timeline that Entergy and North Star want.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was watching for here. You know, Entergy and North Star have said that they want the state to okay this sale by the end of the first quarter of 2018, which seems like a long time, but in the world of the Public Service Board, it's not. I always want to remind people that it took the Public Service Board over a year to approve a concrete pad at Vermont Yankee, so we're talking about the sale of the plant here. So this seems pretty expeditious on their part. At the same time, as you say, they've found time to incorporate these public meetings into the process, so that would satisfy the folks who are looking for a really thorough review.
Yeah, and you spoke with Chris Campany, the executive director of the Windham Regional Commission, one of the people with an interest in participating in these meetings. You also spoke with folks from from the Public Service Department. Everybody seems okay with this timeline, and I'd be interested if you talk a little bit about the timing of these public hearings in regards to the sales process. It seems like everybody is okay with the timeline, including the people who are involved in the transaction.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about the timing of the hearings is that they seem to be scheduled in a way that really is conducive to incorporating the public comment into the review process. So, in other words, the first hearing, I think, is scheduled right before what they call the discovery process, which is where people like Windham Regional get to ask questions of Entergy and North Star. So theoretically, they can take what they hear in a public hearing and take it to North Star and Entergy and say, hey, what about this? The second hearing is scheduled right before what they call the technical hearings in this, which is another opportunity to ask questions of the petitioners. So, Chris Campany at Windham Regional was really pleased not only that the board scheduled these hearings, but that they scheduled them when they did, which is in March and September.
Yeah, and they're really, with that timeline and the timing of those with regards to different decisions at different points, that nobody can argue about the transparency, in my opinion. It doesn't seem like anybody had any concerns, although you just shrugged for the TV camera. What do you think is still of concern there? What's the question mark?
I guess, for me, covering this just for the past few years, I've come to understand that there is always a concern about transparency.
Well, yeah.
There are folks, and I don't mean in any way to denigrate those concerns. I mean, they've had a lot more experience in this than me, but there are always folks who will feel that they don't trust Entergy. They don't trust now North Star coming in, and therefore, are 2 public hearings enough to sort of make this process transparent? That's I guess, in the eye of the beholder.
Do they have to participate in these public hearings? By they meaning Entergy and North Star? Are they people who have to be present at these public hearings, or is this mostly having to do between members of the community and the state?
Yeah, I don't know that they have to be there. The big deal is that the three members of the board who actually will make this decision will be present, and so you'll be speaking if you go directly to them. And
these are both happening in Vernon,
right?
Yeah, where they should be happening, right in that immediate community, open to the public, and certainly they don't have exact dates for them yet, do they? We just know that the general timeline there, so I'm sure more stories will be coming out as they finalize that. So we have dual tracks here with this, right? Because this is just the state portion of the approval of the transaction, and you've written before about the federal approval and how they had the teleconference hearing about this. The NRC having their own track, this doesn't affect their timeline in any way, doesn't influence them as to whether they have public hearings. People would still probably be desirous, I imagine, of having public hearings with the NRC on this issue as well.
They are. I should note that I have written a story. I don't think it's run yet, that Entergy and North Star have filed their application with the NRC as well. That happened late last week. But yeah, in contrast to the state, the NRC has basically said our process doesn't allow for a public hearing, and certainly
doesn't even allow for it.
Well, yeah, there's no hearing built into that process. Now, there are a lot of folks here locally, including the local nuclear advisory panel, who have asked the NRC, please consider coming here so we can talk to you about this sale.
And members of Congress trying to pressure them to do that as well.
They have enlisted some help from the congressional delegation. Yeah.
Could the NRC send a delegate to these public hearings and say, all right, we're part of the process?
Well, they could, but I think there's a lot of there's always an attempt to separate the two. NRC has very specific things that they look at, radiological issues that the state doesn't have any jurisdiction over. So I doubt they'd want to mix those two things. From an outsider's perspective, it seems to me at some point we're going to have an NRC meeting here, especially if the congressional delegation starts to lean on the agency to do that.
And then the other thing I wonder about is, because these are in some ways parallel decision processes, what if the NRC fast tracks their decision more quickly than the state of Vermont does? I mean, the state of Vermont has already laid out this timeline. The NRC could come through and approve it on their level. Do North Star and Entergy then disregard what the state is saying? I mean, they can, according to some, I think, legal contracts, but they could, right? They could make that fight.
Yeah, sort of from a Vermont Yankee nerd's perspective.
Yeah,
it's really cool to see like these two really big, almost cumbersome regulatory processes overlap this way. And what I've not been clear on is how much wiggle room there is for Entergy and North Star. If things start to get delayed, how does that impact the sale? They haven't really set a firm deadline. It says it's at this point we're not going to be able to do this if we don't get the okays that we need.
Yeah. Well, one other story that you wrote about that we think is going to impact the sale is the fact that Elizabeth Miller, who used to be part of the Shumlin administration and was a private attorney initially retained to be part of this transaction, has bowed out of it. You wrote about this story earlier in the week, and just your thoughts on that. It seems like an appropriate move. We were just talking a little bit about it before going on the air. It seemed like people kind of saw the writing on the wall, just didn't want this to be a distraction.
Yeah, that's what Elizabeth Miller is saying. There were several stories that came out where some of the anti-nuclear groups especially were concerned about her participation, whether or not she's essentially going to grease the wheels for Entergy in this permitting process. And Liz says that she just didn't want to be a distraction. I'm not sure. I guess I wonder a little bit if that's really the whole story, but potentially it is.
Well, I had not made the connection until you just point out to me that she's married to Eric Miller, the U.S. Attorney General for Vermont, who just resigned. So certainly they're a package deal, right?
Right.
And maybe he's leaving the state, so maybe she's making plans as well.
Maybe they just need a much-deserved vacation in a warmer spot.
Indeed, maybe so. Mike Faher, my guest here for the remainder of today's program. If people have any questions for us, 802-254-5286 is the number. We continue our conversation with him after the bottom of the hour news break. 27 degrees outside at 20 minutes before the 9 o'clock hour. Green Mountain Mornings continuing with your hosts Chris Lenois and Mike Faher, reporter for VTDigger, the Brattleboro Reformer, and the Commons. Wrote a story last Friday about the vote for the Leland Gray High School and Middle School budget, $6.3 million approved by the voters in the towns of Brookline, Jamaica, Newfane, Townsend, and Windham. Certainly important to be thinking about as tonight Brattleboro Union High School has their annual meeting and people showing up to vote on that budget, a much bigger budget than the Leland Gray budget. But the Leland Gray budget has been something that has been of controversy in the past, failing on a couple of different attempts. So, and with the meeting that you covered that seemed highly contentious, Mike, earlier about some of the things that they were planning to cut from the budget, the fact that there were 276 yes votes to 139 no votes is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I was really surprised by the outcome. As you say, it's been a rocky budget process, a few years running, I think, for Leland and Gray, and for it to pass this easily, given the difficulties in planning this budget, was pretty surprising to me.
And surprising in a way that you go through the breakdown of the votes for each of the different towns to a certain extent. Each town individually, even though this doesn't matter, it's just the sum total of the votes, but each town said, yeah, we're okay with this $6.3 million spending plan. Right,
they did. And I wonder, certainly it's hard to tell with an Australian ballot vote, what people were thinking. You can't tell, really. But at the meeting in December where this budget was finalized, the folks who supported the budget as it was vowed to go out and lobby for it, in the community. And I have to wonder if maybe that played a role.
Yeah, because this does carry a relatively significant increase in taxes for those towns.
It does. It's got a little bit of bad stuff for everybody when you think about it. It's got a tax increase. It's got staff cuts, although not as many as were initially proposed. So I think, though, that the folks who supported the budget saw it as, let's make the best of a bad situation. Let's not cut as many positions as the administration had initially proposed or the board had initially asked for. And they also felt like the tax increase was manageable.
Yeah. One of the things that was cut, and I had a question about this because you said deleting a new assistant principal position.
Yeah.
So that was not a position that was filled. That was just something that they were creating and then they decided to take out of the budget. That in and of itself was pretty easy, although I'm sure at some point the principal would say, boy, I really could use an assistant.
Well, there's a new principal up there, and he's a former sort of Vermont Principal of the Year, I think, and so he's highly regarded, and one of the things he thought they needed was an assistant principal, but pretty clearly and pretty quickly, when the board started asking for cuts, to his credit, he said, well, we're not going to do that. The more contentious things were the teaching positions.
Right.
We're talking about, we're on the chopping block, science position, partial music position, cooperative education position, and a part of a math position.
Yeah. And half of those were cut. The full-time science teacher and the partial mathematics job were the two that were cut.
Right.
The two that were kept were the music instruction position and the cooperative education teaching position. I don't know the makeup of the faculty up there, but can we assume that the science and the math jobs were a little bit more expendable because of duplication?
Well, the math position was interesting because apparently they added it into the current year's budget as almost like deficit spending. Well, we just need this extra, teaching help. And so it actually, when you look at the current year's budget, isn't even in there. But I think a lot of this was the product of that very important kind of pivotal meeting in December that was held at the gym at Leland and Gray, where a lot of people showed up and voiced their concerns about specific programs that were being cut. For instance, money was restored for the snowboarding program because people showed up and said, we want the snowboarding program.
Yeah, well, that's I'm glad you brought that up too, because you're thinking about some of these extracurricular sort of activities and music. I don't mean to make it sound extracurricular, but it is something that normally when schools look at what they're going to cut, they cut the arts, right? I mean, science and math, we need those. I found that a very interesting difference in the decision process in the Leland and Gray district this time around.
It goes to show when people show up and they have an opportunity to voice their opinions, and I've seen it time and time again, these boards listen. And that motion to approve the budget that night was a direct reflection of what the board had heard from the crowd.
no rumblings of a revote on this that you've heard.
You can never be sure.
You never be sure. But 276 to 139, it's not like this was a 5-vote difference or something like that. Certainly pretty decisive there. We'll see what kind of vote happens tonight for the BUHS annual budget as well. Another story that you had, and a nice departure, I'm sure, for you, from the school act. Well, this wasn't Act 46, but it was still the school beat or the VY beat. You were up in Bellows Falls writing about the Vilas Bridge, which something that comes up from time to time in the Bellows Falls, Rockingham community. Why did it come up again right now?
Well, the legislature's back in session, and 4 of our lawmakers from Windham County introduced a resolution to, I think the headline in VTDigger today says they want to shame New Hampshire into doing something about this bridge. Basically it's resolutions, they're symbolic. It's not like they can force New Hampshire to do anything, but it's really an attempt, I think, to bring some more awareness to the issue.
And the awareness is that people in that Bellows Falls village feel that this bridge would be a boon to what's happening downtown.
Right. I'm learning my Bellows Falls geography, and what they tell me is that the Arch Bridge, which is nearby and is functional, and it's one of the things that New Hampshire points to and says, look, you still have a bridge. A lot of folks feel like those drivers can't very easily find Bellows Falls downtown business district. And whereas with the Vilas Bridge, you couldn't sort of be funneled into that district. That's the key difference, I think.
Yeah, one that goes right into downtown, one that is versus near downtown. Any reason why we know is the Arch Bridge newer? Why have they chosen, they being New Hampshire, chosen to maintain the Arch Bridge versus the Vilas Bridge? Because again, they make these 10-year plans. They're going to do maintenance on one bridge, not another, and maybe the Arch Bridge is newer. I don't know the history of that.
Yeah, I believe it's newer. It sounds to me as if the Vilas Bridge was a victim of it was built in 1930, and it had reached the point, as all bridges do, where you make a decision. What are we going to do about this bridge? And the state of New Hampshire in 2009 decided it's just not worth it, and they shut it down, and it stayed that way.
But Matt Treber, right there in Bellows Falls, somebody who thinks this is important. I find that interesting that many lawmakers from that area see this as something worth pursuing. I mean, obviously, there's only so much you can do to try and make another state pay for something. But the fact that they're not just saying, look, we've got the Arch Bridge, let's just live with it. They actually see a real economic benefit to having this bridge improved and reopened.
Yeah, I mean, it was Matt Treber, Carolyn Partridge, and David Dean and Mike Merwicki all signed on to this resolution. And, one of the interesting things to me in researching this story is that the state of Vermont has actually offered to pay for the repair rehabilitation of the Vilas Bridge if New Hampshire would do other bridge work to essentially pay Vermont back over a period of years. And for some reason, even that hasn't gone anywhere. Yeah,
they've made attempts to try and negotiate this many times, and Treber says, I'd be interested in seeing this. Maybe I'll ask Matt about it, how downtown businesses can document their loss of sales. And actually, this other part, too, town and village officials have shown concerns related to public safety. How does that play into the Vilas Bridge?
Yeah, I talked to the municipal manager there, and the only thing he cited in regards to public safety is that he feels that the way the train tracks are situated, traffic gets held up a lot at the Arch Bridge several times a day. And the way he put it was, if you're in an ambulance and you're trying to get to Dartmouth Hitchcock, that's not a good thing.
Right. Okay, so that I can see the point there now. Spanning all of Windham County in the last week, not only Townsend and Vernon and Bellows Falls, but also over in the Mount Snow Valley with a story that you had in, this is last Thursday's paper, about Peak Resorts and Mount Snow. They've got the EB5 money, the $52 million. They've got tons of snow out there. Yeah. Full steam ahead for Mount Snow and the folks at Peak Resorts. A good news story. It's nice to end on a good news story.
Yeah, they had such a rough year last year between not being able to access the EB5 money and their snowmaking project was delayed. And then on top of that, they had a terrible winter last year, as did all the resorts in the Peak company, and it was just a double whammy. And so it looks as if Now with, as you say, access to the EB5 money and also a really strong winter, it's a bounce back year for Mount Snow.
I had forgotten that they own Hunter Mountain now.
They do.
Which is in New York State.
Right.
I don't remember the exact town. Is it Hunter, New York? Is that the town? Yeah. So they have some nearby resorts. They also have at least one, if not two, in New Hampshire. But you point to this Peak Pass, which allows basically access to all the different resorts. Most of the resorts are still in the Midwest, are in places like Missouri and Ohio. And I know they don't release skier visits by individual mountains, but I'm wondering how many people from those areas are taking advantage of the bigger mountains, the Northeast mountains. Is that a type of information that they would disclose?
Well, you're right. I mean, one of the frustrations for me is that when I write about a company like Peak Resorts, the great thing is that they're publicly traded, so they issue these kind of updates. What they don't do is tell us how the individual resorts are doing. They consider that proprietary. But what they have said specifically is that Peak Pass that they've instituted for this season, which is, I think it's 6 or 7 resorts, you basically buy a season pass to all those resorts in one fell swoop. And what they say is that has driven traffic to all of those resorts, but specifically to Hunter Mountain and Mount Snow. They mention those specifically.
Yeah. Paid skier visits up 40% compared with the same time last year. Season pass sales up 28% compared to the same time last year. That shows that people have confidence in their business plan to me, the fact that went up by 5 points.
Yeah, one of the things that they keep talking about, they being Peak, is they feel like there's a lot of pent-up demand from last winter.
Yeah.
People just wanted to spend money on skiing, and they couldn't do it last year.
Yeah, well, they're certainly getting their chance this year, and less expensive for Peak to not have to make the snow, that they got the natural stuff out there, and heading into President's Week, which is always a great, profitable week for ski resorts. Mike, you probably don't have time to hit the slopes. You probably got a lot of stories on tap here. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I wrote a story yesterday about detailing the 200-plus page application to the NRC that was filed late last week by Entergy and North Star to try to get that process going. So that's one of the things that will be showing up here in the next few days.
All right. We'll be finding that, I'm sure, on VTDigger.org, as well as in the pages of the Brattleboro Reformer and the Commons. All of them get Mike Faher's benefit of his writing, and we do too. Appreciate it. Mike, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be back to wrap up this edition of Green Mountain Mornings right after these messages.